Welcome to the Biz Easy podcast, where small business is simplified for greater results. Brought to you by Resources and Development. Go to www.resources-development.com for help in taking your business to the next level. And now, help me welcome the host of the Biz Easy podcast, Steve McCrillis.
Welcome to the Biz Easy podcast, coming to you live from 10,000 feet in Bryan Head, Utah, the Beehive State. If this is the first time listening, then this is where small business is simplified for greater results. My name is Skip, your host today, as we all learn how to stay better focused on the things that make you great. Now I'd like to introduce my partner, Steve. He has been in the small business coaching space for over 20 years and will enlighten us on our topic du jour. And I understand that today we will be riffing. Is that right, Steve?
Well, we won't be riffing, but we will understand what riff is. In fact, I titled the blog Riff for a very specific purpose. It would cause you to say, what is a riff? Might not be what you think it is.
What is a riff?
What in the world is a riff? We are all familiar with business expressions, platitude, and the ever-changing landscape business undergoes with the changing economy, especially of late. Such is the case with management concepts and processes to deal with them. RIF, R-I-F, is the acronym for Reduction in Force. What's that, you say? Well, in the 80s, the same concept was called downsizing. Well, apparently that was too harsh, because in the 90s, we called it right-sizing. Now, does it sound familiar? Well, the process by which a company reduces its workforce to adapt to a decrease in human capital personnel needs is common when the company encounters a decreased demand for that product or service in the market. So how and when does a company decide that a RIF is necessary? Well, let's discuss.
Steve, I've gone through a few RIFs in my life, but they were mostly ex-girlfriends. So what I gather, RIF is a contemporary expression used for a concept or process we've all known for the past few decades. Like what has happened at Twitter recently, 80% of the employees are G-O-N-E gone.
That is exactly what a RIF is, and it's not really publicized or it's not really reported that way, but that's exactly what a RIF is. If you followed contemporary business news, you have likely heard that Bed Bath & Beyond has recently closed over 200 stores across the country. Now, the reason that the retail chain made this move has not been widely debated, but the outcome was in the cards as little as 2 years ago. Now, at its peak, most stores employed 30 to 50 employees per location. Well, as sales began to decline, the need for logistic personnel, sales staff, administrative people also declines. Now, similarly, Toys R Us and Radio Shack, who I'm sure you've heard of, recognized their demise years ago largely for reasons of demand, available options, and an inability to change with the changing economy. Other such examples might include Blockbuster and Kodak. As you know, most of these types of declines happen gradually. Thus, personnel layoffs and employment terminations also come gradually.
I hear you saying the word gradually, but a RIF isn't a gradual process, is it? It seems kind of sudden.
It is, in fact, not a gradual process. Then let me continue with a couple of other industries. The tech and online industry to deliver a product that's not on the shelf and doesn't require great retail space or sales personnel like Bed Bath & Beyond store requires. The most of their staffing comes in the form of programmers, coders, marketing professionals, and a host of other administrative personnel. In these cases, most of the employed persons are viewed on the income statement as overhead, much like office and rent and utilities. There are a variety of ways in which accounting and finance professionals measure and guide company performance and account for the human element. In a conventional income statement, you would find it under cost of goods. You're going to have labor, you're going to have materials, which then gives you gross margin. But the bottom line is, well, in fact, the bottom line. If any company recognizes, hopefully in advance, a gradual decline in sales and subsequently their profit, changes must be made to keep the company in solvency and in operation.
That may be true, but a RIF sounds like a drastic move. I assume that if companies simply reviewed their costs more regularly, they could avoid a RIF, couldn't they?
You're absolutely reading that correctly. In some of these cases, the company recognizes that innovation and technological advances in delivering their product or service requires fewer people to provide the same sales volume to the consumer with a non-diminishing bottom line. An example of that would be the processor that both Microsoft and Apple used until they came up with a different means. Well, hence, a RIF is inevitable when your bottom line is diminishing. When the human element reaches a point where the gross margin can no longer support the existing overhead with a planned profit outcome, changes are often made. Now, it is never a comfortable event for a company, but in the interest of its investors and its appeal in the marketplace to stay in business, a RIF may become its only option. In most cases, when insolvency or bankruptcy is the predicted outcome, it is understood that all other costs, savings costs, otherwise, are considered before the company chooses to reduce its workforce. Now, the unfortunate reality is that some company management teams may be operating, to your point, with insufficient information, financial data, to accurately predict future outcomes. In other cases, an unsteady management team, somebody that may not be paying attention to their financial information, may ignore the signs of insolvency for entirely too long. In such a case, it is not unusual for a CEO or a board chairman to step in and make the hard decision. When the aforementioned organizational decision makers are faced with the choice, it is for the benefit of the rest of the staff and its investors. Let's face it, if they chose to reach insolvency or bankruptcy, everybody loses. But the upside of RIF is I have to make a reduction in force to minimize the impact or maximize the outcome by avoiding bankruptcy. But the outcome is required. The prevailing question becomes, is a RIF avoidable? The answer is complicated, but the logic is really quite simple.
It always comes back to analysis and metrics, doesn't it, Steve?
You're absolutely right.
So what you're saying, though, is a RIF typically becomes necessary if and when a company realizes that the market changes, the sales volume changes, or a tsunami of events have occurred concurrently to put a company in peril.
That's exactly right. But why did they wait for the company to be in peril to make a decision? A RIF is not a favorable decision, but it is one that becomes almost a last-ditch effort. But again, let's remember who we're trying to protect. We're trying to protect the investors, the shareholders, in many cases, creditors, other people who are also employed. Now, a RIF is largely a process that a company of many employees must deploy. But even a small business of 10 or fewer employees can recognize when they are slumping into a place of financial concern. Now, the qualifier here is if, and this comes back to your point, if they can or choose to see through the window of financial measurables and make a decision that will alter the course of the company before it gets worse. Are they properly measuring company performance, product and sales performance, rising cost controls, gross margin, profit margin, along with fluctuations in market demand, and a host of other measurable KPIs or key performance indicators? Now, if they are truly on their game, the simple answer is often yes. Yes, they can make incremental changes to avoid having to make big changes like a RIF.
We're not just talking about personnel changes. This could be pivoting to a new business line. It could be, like you say, implementing some sort of austerity program to keep expenses down. But if we're paying attention to our business regularly, barring an act of God or the Federal Reserve, which is, I think, small g God, we should also be able to avoid those large layoffs such as these, don't you think?
I absolutely agree with that. Anybody that's witnessed or been encountered a RIF will say the exact same thing. Why did we wait till this point? But when you're talking about multitudes of employees, thousands, 7,000, 8,000, 16,000, which you've seen some of these companies do, it's a cautionary tale to see companies like Meta, Amazon, Zoom, eBay, PayPal, IBM, and Spotify, who have all recently had to embrace a RIF for failing to deliver the profit performance that is expected by its investors, its stockholders. Now, the smaller the company, the easier it is to control. That is, if you watch the KPIs. At the rate that multinational companies generate revenue and must control the many moving parts required to stay competitive, it almost seems easy by comparison to control a much, much smaller company. Now, my business colleague, friend Skip, often says, if you treasure it, you should measure it. You've made several comments to that very effect. For all of you reading this blog who own a small business or even work at a small to medium-sized company, understand how you and others, particularly in leadership, can measure your performance and that of your company to make correctional changes before they get worse. After all, Stephen Covey was quoted as saying, "I am not a product of my circumstances. I am a product of my decisions."
Yeah, I love what you said here, Steve. But it takes me back to some major companies that have fallen over the years, and the one that comes to mind for me is like Sears and Roebuck, right? It was huge. Everybody shopped at Sears and Roebuck every week. Everybody had a Sears charge card. They were indebted to Sears, and now the company is out of business. I mean, how the mighty do fall, don't they? And I
Well,
guess that go ahead.
to your point, the companies that you're referring to are thousands, hundreds of thousands of employees. Why do they wait so long to make the incremental changes that we think are necessary? Now, you've coached many clients where they are in a situation of financial peril. In fact, there are many that have come to us and said, "I need help. I got myself in an unreconcilable situation financially, and I'm not sure how to manage my way out of it." Well, for the beginning of their career, they managed to collect the money and to pay what they needed to pay. As the volume grew, what happens? Well, they have to shift from being a person that does the work, and I've said this many times, a person that does the work to a person that runs a business that does the work, because it isn't going to run itself. So now I have to shift from being able to get out on the backhoe and do the work, or get out on the floor of the manufacturing and help these people get through the process. Now you have to figure out, how exactly do I limit my overhead so that the product that I'm putting out with the margin that I know that I have been accustomed to, and it's shrinking, how do I manage this for positive cash flow? Now, again, you've seen many of these things. What are the first steps? What do you look at? I mean, what's your thought?
Well, I mean, and I was going to mention too that it seems like it's not always the people who get caught in this riff are not always the people whose fault it may be. It's not operations fault that somebody didn't see that the market was changing. It's not their fault that the salespeople didn't bring in as much as they said they would this year, and so forth and so on. Or maybe economic situation nationwide. Again, it's not always the fault of the people that get caught in the rift. But I also think that some of these large companies, they're focused on quarterly profits, stockholder dividends, and that precipitates these drastic measures. If you're a small or medium-sized business, then you'd be more focused on the long-term growth and profits, thereby hiring more cautiously and laying off more rarely, or at least I would think.
And I would agree with you completely. I mean, many of the companies that we've coached are typically under 50 employees. And when you see that one of their profit centers is waning, well, you look at the staff that is required to produce that product and or service, and you realize, well, we may have to make some cuts there. So when you have to, unfortunately, you have to lay off 2 or 3 people. For a company of 20 employees, 2 or 3 people may sound like a riff. That's a reduction in force. I give you that.
Right.
But when we talk about RIF, we're talking about Amazon recently announced another 16,000 employees that they're going to lay off. Now, could they have avoided that if they watch their metrics? When you're driving a ship the size of Amazon, it's like the Titanic when you hit the iceberg. I mean, there's very little that you could do at that point. So
Right.
I give them a pass for some of that. But in small business, you have the ability to pivot so easily and so quickly and so often that to avoid something like that is absolutely doable. Absolutely, to your point.
Right, that's a competitive advantage of a small, medium-sized business, isn't it? And and also as a bonus, they might find some good talent when these large companies do make these major layoffs, right?
Well, in our current economic climate, having just come through COVID, you may have heard of it. Happened a couple of years ago. Well, many businesses that were tied to people working from home and people living at home, Zoom is a classic example. Their stock prices soared. And what did they do? And Peloton is another classic example. All of a sudden, people are at home and they're buying exercise equipment and they're working off of their computer to attend meetings. Well, if you look into the future, hindsight is always 2020. We agree with that. But because of that change in economic position, these companies soared. Now, all of a sudden, Peloton got caught with their pants down, building a 10,000 square foot manufacturing plant, someplace in the East, and they had to cancel that entire plan because the demand suddenly fell off. Now, because we look back and say, well, how did you not see that coming? And we see these things in the news. We say, how did you not see that coming? As a small business owner, you have to be able to see those things coming. I mean, even during COVID, many of the small business owners that we came in contact with had to make a reduction in force because they just didn't have the bandwidth to support the kind of workforce that they had previously. But again, when you're talking about 5 employees against 25, you may consider that is a reduction in force. We understand that. But some things in economy are inevitable. It's just one of those things you have to do. Now, my other experience came in 2008, 2009. You may remember the Great Recession. Well, many companies that I had worked with at that time, they held on to their employees because they didn't know how long this economic disaster would last. And you don't know until you look back on it and say, well, that lasted 2 years. Well, in the meantime, you're thinking, well, if I just keep my good people, because I don't want to lose good people, if I just keep them, I can hold out. Some companies, a classic example here in Nashville, there's a company called the Barn Store. And during the COVID, most of the high-level people in that company, foremen and so on, agreed not to take their pay to keep the company going. Wow. So when things came back, they essentially donated their time, and they are now a flourishing company. In fact, I'm working with a local, not that this is a plug for them, but they've managed to manage through it because it's a small company. They were able to pivot, and now they have got business beyond their wildest imagination, given what's happened.
Well, that reminds me, I think our next podcast is going to be about recession proofing your business. So we can look forward to that.
No, I think it's a great article, and I really hope you tune in because a lot of those measures, many times, I've been out doing analysis in small business for over 20 years. And when I started, I said, well, what is your plan B? They weren't focused on sales and marketing. And I asked, why are you not focused on sales and marketing? I can't even keep up with what I got, I heard. I said, there's always something that happens. Well, at that time, 2004, 5, 6, nothing really happened. And then all of a sudden, 2007 and 8, and now 2009 and 10, I'm saying, what are you doing to continue to gain and grow your sales? Well, now they got a perspective. They know they have to. But until you absolutely, jump from the pan into the fire, you don't realize that you have to prepare for those kinds of contingencies that you cannot predict.
Business cycles, you're absolutely right. But there's also the obsolescence thing, right? I mean, the buggy whips and the pet rocks that that some of them spike up and then drop right off, and some of them just go away because technology changes. And it's and to that point, I think it's critical, and especially for small and medium-sized businesses that have the ability to pivot, to be able to have that plan B, to be able to go from making buggy whips to making, I don't know, whatever the next item is that people are going to need is. So obsolescence.
In a symposium that we had delivered some time ago, you had talked about making an analogy between you're a rider of motorcycles, and you always have to. You took a trip up to Alaska, which was an arduous task, I'm quite sure. But you said you have to keep your eyes 20 feet ahead of you, 20 yards ahead of you, and at least 2 miles ahead of you. Well, the same is true in business, because I think the advice that you gave this host of directors was, look, fix what you have right now. Keep an eye on the ball where you are right now, but don't forget to keep that vision of what's going to happen in the future. Always keep an eye down the road to ensure that the decisions you're making will have some long-standing value. Tell me if I've captured that properly.
No, I think that's right. And just as a aside, for the Alaska trip, it wasn't just keeping your eyes in front of you for traffic, or it's the surface of the road. It's the wildlife that could be darting out from the sides of the road. It's somebody making an emergency stop. It's construction on the road. It's detours and sand on the road. All those different things that are thrown in your path between point A and point B. It's no different for a small business. There's going to be plenty of those obstacles that we need to keep an eye out for, which brings us kind of back to your GPS article where we talked about you may not know how to get from point A to point B, but with a GPS and the right tools, the right analysis, you'll avoid the detours. You'll get through. You have to make some decisions along the way.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm going to have to expand on that metaphor that you have about keeping an eye on everything. But again, and I come back to a very fundamental point that you and I have talked about many times, and we have offered this advice to many small business owners. You have to pay attention to working on the business instead of in the business. Now, I know you get your security and your joy from that because you're good at it. I mean, you built a business based on your ability to do something. Until you learn to shift from working in the business to working on the business, you're going to continue to find these things and they're going to slap you in the face, and every single time you're going to kick yourself. We're about up on time. Don't want to take any more time for somebody's drive to work.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in this week, and we'll have another episode for you in a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, Steve, you want to clap us out? That is a wrap.
It's a wrap.